We already introduced last time that NextJS is using a file system connection to create routes, static pages. So everything that we put inside this pages folder will be actually rendered in the same route or path inside our website. We already saw that the index file will correspond to our home, our root of the website. But let's create some new pages. In order to create pages in our GeNYG project, we have the GeNYG Next page command. First of all, we have to specify in which folder we want to create the new page. So let's start in the root directory. We have different options for the page name because we can also create dynamic pages with dynamic parameters, but let's start with a simple page like contacts. Now it is the interesting part. We said that NextJS is optimized for SEO, search engine optimization algorithms. In fact, we can actually build and pre-render our React components and HTML pages before sending to the client. This is really important both for performance, so for the overall user experience, but also for the, as we were saying, SEO algorithms that needs the page to be prefetched and with all the HTML field when asking it from the server. So we have different options. Right now we can choose between static generation or server-side rendering. These two approaches are different in this way. Static generation will happen just once during build time. So when we build our Next.js project, the specific function that we will see right now, the static generation, will generate our page HTML and every files needed, and it will store in a specific folder. So every time there is a request that is actually requesting that specific page, these files will just be returned without delay. Instead, with the server-side rendering, every time there is a request for our browser from our client, the page will be pre-rendered dynamically in the server every time. So if there are, I don't know, query parameters or maybe a session, Next.js will actually render the page for us in the backend and return the compiled ones. So of course the pros are that the page can have some dynamic parameter and every time the result can be different. The cons is that we will lose a little bit of performance because every time the page will need to be pre-rendered on the server side. So let's just create our contacts as static because we don't need any specific data that will be pre-rendered with the server-side rendering. And inside pages, now the new folder contacts has been created with an index file. We can see here that this get static props function has been created by GeNYG, and this is the function that will be called during build time. We will see in the future that it is not really true that this function can be invoked only at build time and then never be invoked again. In fact, there is this feature of Next.js that is called ISR, incremental static regeneration, where we can actually ask Next to rebuild our static content depending on some values. For example, here we can specify a revalidate parameter with a seconds value, like 10 seconds, and this will tell Next.js that every 10 seconds, if there is a new request of this page should be rebuilt. So after 10 seconds, the current cached ones will be delivered to the client, but at the same time, in parallel, a new build of this page will be done, and the next request it will access the new cached page, and so on every 10 seconds. GeNYG initialize our page with this app head. That is just a shortcut for the head component that we saw last time, where we can specify a title for our page and a description. We can also put other meta tags, but we will see this in the future. So if we go now in our website, we can actually navigate the new page. That is an empty page, of course, but we already can see that the contacts title is working. So if we go back here and we just put some random stuff like this high. It's quite little, but maybe here you can see better. Of course, there is no CSS, no styling at all, but you can see that everything is working fine. So let's do one step further right now. Imagine that we want now to create a nested page inside our contacts. So instead of selecting the /pages root folder, now we will select contacts and choose this directory. And I don't know, we can name the new page about with static generation props. Now we have inside contacts the new folder has been created with everything needed, of course, and here we can do the same. About, save, and now /contacts /about, we will have our new page. So when the get static props is really needed, just to understand how it works, let's say here that we have a title string prop that we can read here, and we can render with this about. Now this props needs to send all the props requested and required by our component. So we can write title, the title. If we save and we go back here, now we can see that our component is working just fine. Of course, you should imagine that this will not be just passing props like this that we can hardcode in our component, but maybe here we can call whatever async function, or even not async. So we can access our DB, we can access JSON files, we can call APIs, we can do whatever we want, and everything that we will get through these functions we can pass to our component. It is important here to understand that this function will be executed backend server side. So we have access to the file system, to APIs, to our DB. It is code that is only executed by the backend, so in the Node.js environment, not the browser. And this function will only be executed server side and not in the browser. Now let's try to put something random, like this. If we go back to our page and we refresh, now we will get a different math random number at every request. This is something that it's happening only because we are in development mode. So every time we are requesting this page, even if this page should be actually rendered statically and cached, since we are in developing mode, this value is always recalculated for testing purpose. So if we modify our components, we can see how the static generation of the page affects. But let's try now something different. Let's stop our dev command and let's build our application with the build command. This will generate all the static files. In the recap, we have here all the files, the CSS, the 404, the hello API that we will see later, the contacts page and the contacts about page. And also we have these nice icons here that will show if we are using static generation, it is something like server side like this API, etc, etc. So now if we start our application, instead of going in development mode we just started, and we open again the same URL, now you can see that every request we will always have the same random number that has been generated during build time, stored in the cache, and this will never change. Let's check now what we were talking about before, the revalidate function. We will put, let's say, 5 seconds. So every 5 seconds, every new request will regenerate our page. So let's rebuild it again. Let's start it again. And if we navigate again here, we can see the random number. And you can see that this random number will stay the same for about 5 seconds. After 5 seconds, if I make another request, I will regenerate a new page, and the next request will actually get the new built page. So new page is built, new request, new value. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Next request, the current page is returned, but the new page is built. Next request, the new page is actually returned. After 5 seconds, again, it starts all over. Let's go back in development mode. We can remove this revalidate. So let's see now the difference between static and server-side rendering. So I will generate a new page, GeNYG Next page. Inside contacts, choose this directory. Let's call it about SSR with server-side rendering props. A new folder is created about SSR with, again, almost the same code as before, with this difference. Instead of get static props, now we have get server-side props. So let's add again a title string as a prop that we can render here, and we can pass as prop math.random.string. Now if we navigate to about SSR, now every request here will generate a new random number, but it is something that we are expecting also with the static generation. But if we stop development mode, we'll build again our application, and then we start it. Now you see contacts about SSR is generated, start. If we navigate again inside this page, every request will generate a new random number. This means that the get server-side props is actually called for each request. Instead, our about without SSR will work as expected. It will cache the result for 5 seconds. After 5 seconds, actually no, now it will just cache and show always the same result because we removed the revalidate option here. Without revalidate, this page will be cached forever. So let's go back in development mode. Of course, for server-side rendering, everything is the same for static generation. So here also we can access each request. Of course, the context is a little bit different because with static generation, actually we don't have a real context of the request because the content returned is always the same. Instead, with server-side rendering, yes, we have all the data. We can access all the data of the request, the headers, we can access query parameters and everything because the call, the rendering is dynamic. Every time there is a new rendering, we can access the request parameters and return a different result. Now, let's check what are these dynamic pages instead. So I will create a new page inside the root of pages. This I will call just news with static generation props is fine. So imagine that we have this news folder with a news list. And if I navigate to news, this is actually the really simple result. Now imagine that we want to connect all this news to each specific page with details. So we will invoke again GeNYG Next page. This time we will go inside news. choose this directory, and instead of just putting a name, we will actually put the square brackets with the dynamic parameter inside. In this case, I will call it news ID. Since now the page is not a real component, but it is a square dynamic brackets name with the parameter inside, GeNYG is asking us for the component name that we want to use. So in this case, we can put news details. Again, we can decide the strategy, and we can go with static generation. Now the new folder news ID is created. The page is created as well. So now we can see here that it is using the component name that we decided. And we have also something new, that is this get static path function. So what's going on here? Since we specified that our page has a dynamic parameter, it means that when we are statically generating these pages, it will not correspond to just one page. Let's say localhost / news, localhost / contacts / about. But we can have localhost / news / 1 for the news with ID 1, localhost / news / 2 for the news with ID 2, etc., etc. So we can have multiple pages for the single here dynamic page component that we are creating. To dynamic and actually generate, or to statically more than dynamic, generate these pages during build time, NextJS expose this function here, get static paths. Thanks to the one, we can actually specify what are the different paths for this specific page. And you can see here that already GeNYG is actually suggesting us how should be the format, because he knew that each news details is accepting this news ID as parameter. So here we are returning a paths array, where for each array we have an object. For each object we have these params, and for these params we have this news ID. So we can actually build these paths following this schema. I will just remove these. I will create this news array with ID 1, 2, and 3. I will map this array with our object, news ID, it will be this one. So now during build time, next we'll know that we are actually creating 3 different pages for news / news ID, with the news ID equals to 1, 2, and 3 respective. And every time we are rendering, actually we can access that ID here in the get static props. In order to do that, we can specify these params, and with props we can say title params dot news ID. It will correspond to this parameter here. So we can now specify here title. Actually, let's call it for what it is, news ID. News ID, news ID. Perfect. Now let's check what's going on. So if we navigate to news / 1, I will have news details for 1, news details for 2, news details for 3. If I specify 4, I'm still getting a page. Why? Because even if I didn't specify that this page news / 4 should be generating during build time, I'm still getting this get static props re-rendered for every request. So if this current page is not actually cached in our Next.js application, it will still be invoked and created dynamically the first time. We can see this behavior better during build time. So let's build our application. And now we got news and news/news ID with 1, 2, and 3. And this is coming thanks to get static path. So if we start our application, we can now see that going to news 1, it is returning the page, news 2, the new page, but even if I navigate to news 4, the page is returned. So even if it was not built during building time, since I'm requesting a dynamic path, NextJS will realize that it doesn't have this page inside its cache, and it will just render it the first time for us. After it renders for the first time, it caches the result and just returns to us for the subsequent requests. In order to see this behavior, we can add again a random parameter. In this case, we can go with a date, new date. Since new date is actually an object, we have to convert it on the fly to a string that is serializable, and then we can send it safely here. String, can remove this. Now, all the first 3 pages are generated almost at the same time. So I expect that when we navigate these cached pages, we will get almost the same date. So news 1, 8:49:30 to 8:49:30, something different. 8:49:30, again some milliseconds of difference because of the building time. But if now we navigate to a 4th page that has not been built before, this page will be built dynamically, and in fact now some minutes are passed and we are at 8:50. If we go back to 3, we still got this 8:49:30 that are the pages that we built at the first time. If I navigate to 4 again, I will get exactly the same time because now the page is built and stored in our application. Instead, if I navigate to a 5th page that is not built yet, it will be built on the fly and returned. In fact, now we have, at the 30 seconds are passed, we got 8:50:35. If I refresh, always the same cached page will be returned. If I go back to 4, the previous page of 30 seconds ago is returned, and the same for 1, 2, and 3. So all these pages now are built and cached and returned for each further request, and whenever I specify a new parameter instead, the new page will be built in this current time. So what if one of these ID doesn't exist actually? Because if we can specify this dynamic parameter, maybe I have news up to the ID number 30, but the 31 doesn't exist anymore. We can also handle that with next, of course. So if we can say params.newsID, let's convert to an integer first, is greater than 30, then we can return not found. Let's save it. Now we can switch back to dev. So if I invoke this page, everything works, but if I call with news ID 40, the page 404 is displayed. Because by returning not found true, actually what we'll next do is to not show the current page, but it will just redirect to the page 404 that we can actually also customize in the future. So what now if we want to generate a page that actually doesn't render or doesn't take in consideration only a single dynamic route, but it can have different paths, dynamic and changing? Let's create a new page. First of all, in the root directory, we can call this generic. We just need a container, honestly. So let's now create inside our generic page a double squared brackets page with these params. Generic page with static generation props. Doesn't really matter. So now inside our pages we have generic, inside generic we have these parameters. If we navigate right now inside it, we can see now that we got an error from Next.js. Why? Because we are declaring these ... params with the double square brackets that is actually catching everything in that page, but we are also declaring an index file that is this one inside the generic. And the only difference that we should remember about this notation here is that this notation here will not only be considered something after generic, but also the generic page as well. So in order to make this work, we have to remove the generic index page and just leave this notation here. So if we go back to our localhost and we go to generic, everything works. Also, another difference is that before we had news ID with a value, so it was more like an object. Instead, with these multiple route dynamic paths, all the parameters arrive as an array, exactly in this way. Of course, we can read what are all these parameters in the context of get static props or also server-side rendering. So we can understand, given this route, if we are inside generic slash something slash else. As you can see, everything of this will work because right now we are catching all of the sub-routes of generic, and given these params prop with the array of the single routes, of course, we can decide during static or dynamic generation what to do with this information and what to render to the end user. Okay, now that we introduced almost all the possibilities that we have creating static or server-side render pages with Next, let's add some dynamic to everything. So here we have our news list. We can add here a link . We will import this link and we can specify the href news 1, news 2, news 3. Perfect. So if we go back now to news, these are actually links that will bring us exactly to the same page. This link component, it is the one imported from Next. So this is one of the best way to handle linking inside Next static pages.